They dug them up twice. Once by order of the county and once, quietly in secret, by someone who left no shovel marks, no broken sod, no disturbed grass. Just empty caskets, still nailed shut from the inside. The smell told a different story. Not rot, something older, almost like cedar and damp earth. As if the coffins had never held bodies at all. But the town remembered. The deaths had been public, the funerals well attended, and yet in the summer of 1948, the two boys were seen again. Walking, talking, aged, not quite righter. Mississippi was the kind of place that never really left the Reconstruction. By the late 1940s, the war had given them electricity and paved roads, but not much else. The swamp still came up to the edge of town in rainy months, and when it receded, it left behind things nobody talked about, bones mostly. Sometimes animal, sometimes not. The town sat too close to the Pearl River, and too far from any real city to ever truly matter. And that was the way they liked it. Privacy was currency in Redwater. Secrets were never buried deep, they were stacked layer upon layer like silt in the riverbed, waiting for the right flood to stir them loose. The Greaves family had lived on the edge of town since before the Civil War. Their land sat low, just where the river curved west like a hooked finger, catching runoff from the higher ground. That land was black and soft and rich, but it came with a cost. The soil remembered everything. Insects bred too fast there. Trees grew gnarled and bloated with moss, and strange mists rolled across the fields at dusk, especially near the old well, which nobody drank from anymore. The Greaves boys, Thomas and Elijah, were the last of their line. No daughters. No cousins. Their mother had died in childbirth. Their father, in 1932, was found hanged from the barn rafters with a rosary clutched between his teeth. By 1948, the house was mostly rotten timber, but the boys still lived there. Or at least, that was what people had believed. The deaths came quietly. Thomas first, then Elijah, just 2 days apart. No violence, no accidents, no disease that anyone could name. The official cause was exhaustion due to agricultural exposure, a phrase so vague and useless it became a joke in town. The bodies had been pale, lean, dry-looking, as if the blood had been drawn out of them over months. The doctor had noted no marks, no signs of illness, just slack mouths, sunken eyes, and nails brittle enough to crumble. They were 22 and 25, and dead without explanation. The funeral was strange even by Redwater's standards. No preacher would do the burial. A traveling reverend from Vicksburg performed it, though no one could say who hired him. The coffins were nailed shut and sealed with wax. No viewing, and it had rained hard that day, so hard the cemetery gate swelled shut behind the last mourner. And for days afterward, the clay at the graves sank unevenly, as if the ground were still shifting beneath the surface. And then the sightings began. At first they were whispered. A figure glimpsed near the well at twilight. 2 silhouettes walking side by side along the old road to the swamp. A knock at the back door of a farmhouse after midnight. No one there when opened. Muddy prints trailing away, barefoot and narrow, not made by any child. The sheriff dismissed it as nerves. Wartime trauma, bad dreams, stress. But the stories multiplied. A man downriver, claimed one of the boys. He thought it was Elijah. Came into his store and asked for lamp oil. Didn't speak right. Voice too flat, too slow, like he was learning the words as he said them. Another farmer's son swore he saw Thomas kneeling in the river shallows, washing something dark from his hands. By mid-July, the town held a quiet meeting in the back of the church. They didn't invite outsiders. What was said there was never written down, but the next morning, 3 men and a deputy rode out to the Greaves' property with shovels. They expected to find disturbed earth. They didn't. The graves looked untouched, but the caskets were empty. The seals had been broken, the wax rings melted. Not a trace of remains, no bones, no hair. Nothing but dirt and splinters and a smell no one could name. And that's when the records stopped making sense. There's no death certificate for Elijah Greaves anymore. Not in the county archive. Not in the state rolls. Thomas's file exists but is missing the signature of the attending physician. The newspaper obituary has been cut out of every archived issue. Microfilm reels from that year skipped 3 weeks with no explanation. The church ledger has 2 entries for July 3rd, both in different handwriting and both naming the same burial plot. And yet people remembered. The grave digger remembered. The sheriff remembered. Old Miss Harper, who lived closest to the Greaves' land, remembered what she saw on the morning of July 9th. 2 figures, walking the edge of the mist. Near where the trees bent toward the old well, she said they were wearing the same suits they'd been buried in. Sunday clothes too fine for fieldwork. Only wrong, stiff. As if they didn't bend right at the joints. She said they were smiling, but not at her, not at anything. Just smiling, as if something inside them remembered the idea of joy, but had long forgotten the feeling. No one believed her until the McTavish dog disappeared. Then the fire at the schoolhouse. Then the well water turned black for a week, and 5 families reported hearing voices behind their walls after dark, low voices, whispering words they didn't understand. The town grew quiet. People locked their doors before sundown. Lamps stayed lit through the night. The Reverend left town in August, taking his family without so much as a goodbye sermon. And the Greaves' land stayed quiet. No one went near it. The trees there were always a little too still. The mist came even on dry days, and when it rained, the runoff smelled sweet like rotting flowers and rust. What happened to Thomas and Elijah Greaves in that house? What could twist a body in death so gently it left no marks, no signs of violence, but also no peace? There is one photograph. It wasn't found until 1976 during a demolition of the old church office. A cracked black and white snapshot, undeveloped and buried in a desk drawer beneath tax receipts. Two men standing at the edge of a field, distant, grainy, their faces hard to see, but there's something in the posture, the symmetry, the unnatural stillness of their arms, their necks, their gazes, like they hadn't moved for a long time, like something else had moved them there. No one can say who took it. No negatives were ever found, but someone wrote on the back in faded pencil, "The boys came back wrong." The Greaves land was surveyed once back in 1892, when Redwater's boundaries were being redrawn for the last time. The county sent a man from Jackson, a land clerk named Silas Darnell, who carried 2 measuring rods, a brass compass, and a journal he kept in the inside pocket of his coat. He was supposed to spend 3 days mapping the riverbank and surrounding acreage. He left after one night and never submitted his final report. His journal, however, was found in 1928 when the levee road was widened, buried in a metal tin beneath a tree stump. It contained only 4 entries, the last one smeared by water and nearly unreadable. The pages spoke of strange depressions in the land, unnatural silences at dusk, and a well that gave off no echo when he dropped a stone down its throat. "There is something buried here," he wrote. "Not bones, but memory, layered, compressed, wet." His final words scrawled diagonally across the paper. "I fear the land has kept more than just water." The well had always been the center of the property, long before the Greaves family ever built their home. Early maps, crude things made by river traders and cotton speculators, marked the spot as Lower Black Spring. Though no spring was ever formally recorded, the water was clear enough but foul-tasting. Local legend said it turned sweet only after a bloodletting, a detail dismissed as old superstition, though one that crept into the town's oral history all the same. No one ever claimed to see a ghost there. But no one lingered either. Thomas and Elijah were both born during a yellow fever outbreak in 1923. Their mother, Clara, delivered them at home, assisted only by a midwife from the far end of the county, a woman named Mamie Morell who had a reputation for using strange herbs and kept no written records. Clara bled out by morning, and Mamie disappeared 2 days later, leaving behind her cart, her mule, and a pot of simmering roots no one could identify. The boys survived, but something in them never seemed to fully settle. By age 7, Elijah spoke in full sentences but avoided contractions, as if the words had to be chosen too carefully. Thomas would stand in the field behind the house for hours unmoving, staring into the trees. They didn't play with the other children. At church, they sat stone still even through the hymns. Once during a thunderstorm, they were found in the barn loft, lying side by side in the hay, eyes wide open, mouths slightly parted, neither blinking. When roused, they said they had not been sleeping, they had been listening for the hum. Their father, Daniel Greaves, was a quiet man, deeply religious, and known to drink alone in the smokehouse when the river rose high. In 1932, when the rains came early, the river breached its bank and flooded the lower field, drowning 2 calves and nearly sweeping the youngest of the boys into the woods. Daniel stopped attending church after that. He began speaking of dreams, of black water that boiled and hissed like tar, of voices beneath the floorboards. He boarded up the windows in the south side of the house, dug trenches around the foundation. On the last day of his life, he was seen digging near the well with bare hands, soil packed beneath his fingernails, muttering to himself about the pact and the inheritance beneath the roots. The suicide came without a note. The coroner ruled it straightforward. A man broken by grief and isolation. But there was something off. He had stuffed the rosary so deep into his mouth that the beads left an impression in the soft palate. The nails used to secure the rope were rusted through, as if they'd been waiting there for years. After his death, the boys took to the land like they had no other choice. They cleared brush, raised chickens, grew root vegetables, but never left, not even once. Not for supplies, not for church. They became something between myth and memory. Neighbors said they saw lights on in the house long after dark, figures moving from window to window in perfect synchronization. Sometimes laughter that didn't quite sound human. Too slow, too hollow, like someone mimicking a sound they only half remembered. And then there was the incident with the Harcourt girl. In 1945, she wandered off from the schoolhouse during recess. The woods behind the playground backed up against the lower edge of the Greaves land. She was missing for 2 hours. When they found her, she was barefoot, dress torn, hands scratched from brambles, but unharmed. She told her teacher she had followed 2 men with soft voices, who said they were friends of her mother. When asked what they looked like, she drew 2 stick figures, each with large, black circles for eyes and hands that ended in points. She never returned to school. The Harcourts moved out of Redwater within the year. After the boys' deaths and the unearthed graves, the land began to rot. Crops turned bitter. Chickens stopped laying. The mist grew thicker. A cat was found drowned in the trough, its mouth packed with river mud. The trees along the property line lost their leaves in August, but it wasn't just decay. People began hearing things. There were reports of knocking from inside walls, measured rhythmic almost like Morse code. Whispers in the attic crawl spaces, the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floor, even in locked, unoccupied rooms. One woman swore she heard someone humming the old hymn, "Low in the grave he lay," from the woods behind her home. But when her husband went to check, he found only muddy prints circling the well, and a dead crone nailed to the fence post, its wings spread, eyes missing. It was around this time that the sightings became more frequent and more disturbing. People didn't just see the Greaves boys, they heard them speak. But what they said made no sense. They repeated phrases from old church sermons, asked about people long dead. One man claimed Elijah approached him in the field and asked, "What did they do with the Red Book?" A question he couldn't answer, though it haunted him for weeks. Another swore Thomas stood at his fence one night and said, "The water remembers." Their voices were wrong, not cracked or ghostly, but hollow like echoes from a well, delayed by half a second, mismatched to their lips. The county tried to intervene. Sheriff Claiborne, a hard man who'd served in France during the First World War, assembled a team to burn down the Greaves house in September 1948. They waited until midnight, came with kerosene, shovels, and sidearms, but by morning nothing had changed. The house still stood. The trees still leaned toward the well. One of the men never came back. The others refused to speak of it. Claiborne drank himself into a coma within the month. And in the middle of it all, the photograph. The one found in the church drawer years later. The one that shouldn't exist. It had no timestamp, no markings. Just the two men, standing side by side in the field, backs impossibly straight, arms stiff at their sides, their suits a decade out of date, their faces too smooth, too clean, like masks carved in wax. One is smiling. The other stares straight into the camera with eyes so empty, so flat, they seem to drink in the light, and behind them, barely visible, the well. Every town has stories, ghosts, lies, regrets. But Redwater has a memory that refuses to stay buried. And the brothers, whatever they were part of something older than death, older than the land, and they were still waiting. It was in November that the birds stopped coming back. Migration had always passed over Redwater, following the Pearl River north or south depending on the season. But that year, the sky remained empty. No flocks overhead, no calls at dusk. Not even the blackbirds that nested in the church rafters returned. A silence settled over the town like dust, fine and suffocating, collecting on windowsills, creeping into the lungs. And with that silence came a change in the people. It was the children who felt it first. They began waking from sleep, unable to speak, staring at their parents with blank expressions, mouths trembling open but making no sound. One boy tore his sheets into strips during the night, folding each piece again and again until they were packed tight beneath his mattress. Another was found digging in the schoolyard, his fingers bloody, muttering, "They told me it was under the roots." The town doctor, Lester Myrick, wrote it off as mass stress. He told parents the war had left an invisible mark, that perhaps their children were only mimicking adult fear. But Dr. Myrick hadn't visited the Greaves property. He hadn't seen the house. Because the house had changed. It still stood in the clearing where the trees bent toward the center. But its angles were wrong. The roof slanted unevenly. The chimney had sunk into the structure as if the house had swallowed it. Windows that once faced east now opened west. The back door, which led to the fields, no longer had a step, just a drop into red mud so thick it pulled the boots off a man within seconds. There were no animals, no sounds of life, but the lights were still on, lanterns maybe, or candles, flickering orange glows behind the warped panes, and sometimes shadows, not figures exactly, more like smears, shapes that didn't walk so much as pulse from one side of the window to the other, as if light itself was being bent. Only one man dared enter that house. Jeremiah Tillman had been a logger all his life. He'd worked those woods since he was 16. He said he didn't fear ghosts or devils. Said he'd seen worse things up in the camps during the flood of '37. He went in with a shotgun and a kerosene lamp. He came out 4 hours later, barefoot, burned on both hands, his gums bleeding. He wouldn't speak, not for days. When he finally opened his mouth in the church basement, the only thing he said was, "They are not in the house is in them." He died a week later. The coroner listed exposure, but those who saw the body said it looked like he'd been drowned, his lungs full of river water, his skin pale and bloated. But there had been no rain, and the peril was low. By then, fear turned inward. People began avoiding one another. Eye contact grew sparse. The town square emptied before sundown. The mayor held meetings at his own home, behind locked doors. Families that had lived side by side for 3 generations stopped speaking. Something had curdled in the air. Something slow and chemical, like rot spreading behind wallpaper. And still the sightings came, more intrusive. Thomas was seen in the hardware store asking for wire. Not the coated kind, bare for grounding, he said. His voice was flat but polite. He paid in old coins, all dated before 1912. When the clerk looked up after counting the change, he was gone. No footprints, no breeze from the door. Elijah was spotted on the church steps at midnight, kneeling with his hands clasped. He appeared to be praying, but no sound came from his lips. Just movement, smooth, mechanical, as if the prayer had been rehearsed long ago and forgotten, and his body was simply repeating the motions out of habit. Then came the graves. Not the brothers. Those were still empty. No, these were fresh graves. New ones, on land no one had touched. Dug into the woods just beyond the old barbed fence, arranged in a circle, 7 in total, each marked with a single river stone and a name carved in unnatural precision. No tools could have made those marks. No hand could have written so neatly into granite. The names were not from town records, not from any Bible, but a few bore fragments of memory. Sister Lygia, Reverend Cale, Ruth of the Hollow Tree, the second son who heard the sound. None of the stones had dates, just names, just the waiting earth. And it was waiting. The ground around those stones pulsed. Not visibly, but if you knelt, you could feel it in your knees, like something deep below was breathing. Not fast, not animal, slow, ancient, as if the soil had begun to dream again, and in those dreams, the dead walked in circles and whispered of inheritance. A girl disappeared, Margaret Hale, age 12, left for school, never arrived. Her bag was found on the riverbank, its contents laid out with unnatural care: book, calm, small pocket Bible, lunch wrapped in wax paper. Her shoes were neatly placed beneath the bridge, but her footprints, bare, soft, unmistakably hers, led not into the river but into the woods toward the Greaves' land. Dogs refused to follow. The search party broke off before reaching the house. They said the trees pressed too close together, said the light bent wrong. One man claimed he heard his own name whispered from inside a hollow log. The Hales moved north the next week. They did not hold a funeral. After that, the town fell into an uneasy rhythm. No one spoke of the brothers aloud, but their presence became part of the landscape, like mildew on the church pews or the warped boards on the post office floor. There were rules now, spoken in low voices: don't go near the well after dark. Don't answer knocks without looking through the window first. And if you see someone you haven't seen in a long time, ask them the name of the town's first mayor. If they don't blink when they answer, on and still, the brothers came, not always seen, sometimes heard, sometimes just felt. A flicker in the mirror, the sound of 2 sets of footsteps on a single staircase, a second shadow beneath your own. But the worst, what finally broke whatever resistance the town had left, was what happened to the church bell. It hadn't rung since 1935. The rope had rotted away. The bell itself cracked from heat long ago. But on the morning of December 22nd, just before dawn, it rang 12 times. Then silence. When the townsfolk gathered, no one claimed to have rung it. The tower was empty, the rope still coiled in dust. But there were footprints in the nave, bare, too long, too narrow. 2 sets, side by side, and the air smelled sweet, like rotted flowers, like cedar and damp earth. And beneath the pulpit, scratched into the floorboards, we remember the water. And the water remembers us. That winter, 5 more people left Redwater without notice. The town grew smaller, the land grew quieter, but the brothers remained. Spring came late in 1949. The frost held longer than it should have, lingering on the windows of the church and the iron fence posts along Main Street. Crops failed to sprout in the early thaw. Livestock gave birth to stillborns. Something had shifted in the rhythm of the land, and Redwater, already frayed by months of silence and fear, began to feel like a town waiting for something. Not salvation, but a culmination. A kind of ending that didn't belong to any calendar or book. By April, barely 70 souls remained in Redwater, and the brothers were no longer glimpses at the edge of a field or faint shapes in the dark. They were present now, deliberate, manifest. They came into town on foot. Once, just once, it was a Sunday, warm. The sky soft and colorless like milk. Church had just let out, and families stood quietly in the yard, hands folded, mouths polite. No one spoke of anything real anymore. That was part of the code, the unwritten script of survival. Then someone pointed, not with panic, but with a kind of numbness, like naming a shape in the clouds. 2 figures, walking up from the river path, slow and calm. They wore the same suits they'd been buried in. No longer crisp, no longer clean. The fabric hung loose, damp at the hem, stained along the cuffs with something dark and spongy. Their skin was pale but intact, no visible wound, no sign of decay. But their eyes, those were wrong, not glowing, not bleeding, nothing garish. Just still, like glass set too deep in mask, and their mouths were smiling, not with joy, not even cruelty, just the bare shape of a memory. This is what humans do when they greet each other. A learned behavior. A repeated gesture. They walked to the edge of the churchyard and stopped. They didn't speak. They didn't blink. But their presence cracked something in the air. A kind of pressure behind the ears, like being underwater. And then, without a word, they turned in perfect sync and walked back the way they came, vanishing into the trees. Afterward, Edel calls his mother. They were thinking no one dared. But something broke in the town after that. A kind of spiritual weathering. The people aged rapidly, faces drawn, hair turned white, even among the young. Laughter vanished entirely. Children played in silence or not at all. Births ceased. No pregnancies were carried to term. The local doctor performed no deliveries, only autopsies. The soil changed too. It began with the fields. Root vegetables came up with their twisted. Potatoes split open like infected gums. Beets bled through the sackcloth. Corn turned black before tasseling. The animals grew skittish, then listless, then still. Entire flocks of chickens dropped dead overnight with no sign of illness. Just expressions of eerie calm, as if they had simply decided to stop living. The river's path changed in May. No rain, no shift in elevation, but somehow it carved a new curve, wrapping closer to the Greaves property than it ever had before, like it was bending to reach something, or someone. And that's when the dreams began. People spoke in hushed voices of standing in water waist, deep, unable to move, of seeing their own reflections blinking out of earth, of hearing a voice they once loved calling from beneath the floorboards, promising warmth, reunion, absolution. But it wasn't until the Reed's family, father, mother, and their mute son, disappeared that the town broke its silence. They had lived nearest to the Greaves land in a 2-room shack on stilts beside the cane brake. The mother, Nora, had kept meticulous diaries for years, evidence of a woman gripping her sanity by ritual alone. After they vanished, a cousin found her final entry. The ink was shaky, blotted, rushed. "We heard the hum again last night. It's closer." Harvey says he dreamed he was inside the well, not falling, not drowning, just part of it. Like the stone remembered his name. "I've closed every door, covered the mirrors. I left the Bible open as Psalm 88, but the words won't stay printed. They change. Every morning they change." The house was found empty. The table was set for 3. Plates full, chairs pushed back. No sign of struggle, only footprints bare, leading toward the Greaves land. But this time there was a 4th set, small, child-sized, and behind the house, under the rain barrel, a smear of letters carved into the dirt. "We were always meant to return." The town gathered again. Not in the church. No one went there anymore. They met in the feed store, lit only by kerosene. A windows covered. No minutes were taken. But there was a decision. They would salt the land. Every inch, from the river's edge to the roots of the old pines. They would burn the house, even if it took them with it. They would bury what they could and forget the rest. But when they arrived, shovels, rifles, fuel in hand, there was nothing left to burn. The house was gone. Not collapsed. Not raised, gone. No foundation. No adibris. Only a depression in the earth where the walls once stood. Soft as a grave. Damp, though it hadn't rained in weeks. And in the center, where the hearth once sat, a ring of small objects had been laid out in careful geometry: a silver hair comb, a Bible cracked in half, a child's wool mitten, and the remains of a mason jar filled with teeth. The well still stood, but it was deeper now. So deep that when they dropped a stone, no sound returned. Not a splash. Not an echo. Just a waiting silence, thick and consuming. And near the lip of the well, carved faintly into the stone, as if by a fingernail or thin wire, "We are the memory of this place." After that, people left in waves. Not panic, not screaming. Just packed what they could and disappeared down the highway without saying goodbye. No moving vans, no letters, no explanations. Just a soft, communal vanishing. Redwater was not formally dissolved. It still exists on maps, though no one answers at the listed phone numbers, and all mail is returned. The last census listed its population as 14. But the man who recorded it, an intern from Jackson, barely 22, never filed his report. He was found months later in a hunting cabin near the border, starved and clutching a stack of Polaroids no one could explain. Each one showed the same image of 2 men, backs turned, walking into the woods. The brothers, and in the distance, barely visible between the trees, a black doorway where the well should have been, but wider, much wider, like something had opened. The last known photograph of Redwater was taken from the window of a Greyhound bus in 1951. The highway curves north past what used to be the churchyard, and if you look closely, just above the blurred line of trees, you can see 2 thin figures standing in the clearing. Too distant to identify, too still to be living, but unmistakably there. The road was rerouted a year later. The county claimed erosion. Locals said the trees had begun leaning over the asphalt, cracking the pavement in slow, deliberate arcs like ribs closing around a lung. By then, Redwater was already becoming legend, a footnote in state records. A forgotten town with no current residents and no official explanation for its collapse. There were rumors, of course, tales of strange lights and voices, of a poisoned well. Some blamed bad crops. Others whispered of a sickness of the mind. But none of that explained the dead who returned. None of it accounted for what came after the house disappeared. Because it wasn't over. Not really. In 1953, a team from the University of Mississippi sent 2 graduate students to survey the Redwater region as part of a geological mapping initiative. One was a cartographer. The other specialized in soil stratigraphy. They were told not to speak to locals. They didn't. They returned with a single sample core taken from the Greaves property. Extracted from the earth just outside where the house had once stood, the core told a story that didn't make sense. At 6 feet, normal sediment, rich loam, clay, flecks of bone typical of old farmland. At 10 feet, trace minerals consistent with swamp land and marsh rot. At 15 feet, charcoal residue from a fire that had never been recorded. And then, at 22 feet, the soul change. Compressed layers of ash and silk, strands of woven hair, burned prayer cards. And finally, at the very bottom of the core, a dark, dense silt laced with something organic but not human. The analyst's report referred to it only as anomalous biomass showing patterns of neural growth, as if something had been thinking down there, something that remembered. The students never returned to the site. One dropped out of the program 6 weeks later. The other was hospitalized for what the university described as prolonged fugue state brought on by extreme exposure to environmental toxins. He was found sitting in a dry bathtub covered in mud, whispering, "They are the echo now. They don't live in the world but in what it remembers." A year's passed. Nature reclaimed the roads. Trees split through sidewalks. The cemetery was swallowed whole. And the well, whatever it had become, was no longer visible, hidden beneath vines and rot in a layer of fog that never lifted even in summer. But sightings didn't stop. They spread. Along the Pearl River Basin from the Louisiana border to the swamps of Alabama, people began reporting strange things. 2 men walking in silence. Faces too smooth. Suits too old. Smiling with no expression in the eyes. And everywhere they went, the same signs followed. Dead birds found laid in circles. Children waking with dirt under their fingernails. Wells that stopped echoing. And voices, always voices, speaking from beneath the house, the river, the walls. They said the same thing, over and over, in different mouths and different tones. We remember the water. We remember what was promised. In 1966, a minister in Yazoo City reported seeing 2 men standing in the back of his congregation during a sunrise service. They were barefoot, though the grass was covered in frost. He said they didn't speak or move. But when the choir began singing, "Shall we gather at the river?" one of the men lifted his hand and pointed toward the sky. The minister swore he saw something reflected in the eyes. Not light, not clouds, but something deeper, like the inside of a well. The same year, a letter surfaced from a surviving resident of Redwater, now living in Missouri under a different mailed, found only in a stack of unsent correspondence discovered after his death. The handwriting had decayed with age, water damage, and something else, like the paper itself, resisted preservation. But one passage remained legible. "You cannot bury what was never dead. The land is not haunted. The land is the haunting. They were not born. They were excavated. The well is not a place. It is a mouth, and it remembers every drop." Since then, Redwater has remained unmarked on modern maps. Aerial footage shows only a dense patch of forest, strangely symmetrical, ringed with trees that bend inward, their canopies forming the shape of an open eye. But if you stand near the edge on certain nights, you might hear it. Not voices, not screams, just a hum, low, rhythmic, wet, like breath held too long beneath water. And if you wait there long enough, if you stand very, very still, you might see them. 2 figures in the trees, side by side, smiling because they remember. Not you, not your face, but the land you're standing on, the shape of your weight, the texture of your shadow, because the land remembers everyone who walks on it, everyone who kneels to drink from its rivers, everyone who listens long enough to hear the hum. And once it remembers you, it never forgets.